about when you learn a martial art or you learn a sport, one of the reasons it gets easy, because when you think about when you learn a sport, you first have to learn it with your brain. You have to learn all the steps, all the moves. You don't know it, but once you've practiced it for a while and you know the moves and they're just sort of intuitive to you, then it's like your body remembers. It's kind of like when people they get into a flow state and they don't really have to think about what they're doing. They just kind of do it. And my theory is that when you're in that state, it's like now instead of just your brain having a memory of the steps that you need to take, now your body has a memory, and you feel out the memory to understand it. So when it comes to talking about the nature of the mind from my perspective, it gets pretty complicated, to say the least.
I like that. And this is exactly why I asked this question. Because so I believe that the reason the word head, what we call head, I believe that modern Hebrew has trampled the Hebrew language under a pile of dirty footprints. And so this is what people are regurgitating when they vomit modern Hebrew. And so the word head, I think the word hot, what we call hot, which is the eighth sphere, okay, is what has become the word head. And hot represents these intellectual potentials, right? And there's an infinite potential reflected within hot, where it sort of keeps this infinite potential that is reflected down by the supernal triad, which represents the infinite potential above us, reflected down through the different filtering aspects or nodes of consciousness to become what we call rational thinking. And that rational thinking is represented by what is called hot. I believe hot is a bastardized pronunciation. I think it's probably hit is really better. And from hit became head. And so I see this is very interesting that the word head represents what the eighth sphere of the Kabbalistic tree of life is implying. And it's not really Mercury's thing. That's the interesting point. Mercury fits into that thing very well because Mercury's feet are on Saturn's shoulders, right? And Saturn's place is actually that head, but the head is actually the earth. And so this is I think like what you're sort of fingering at is that what we think is inside our mind is what we identify with, right? So what is mine is what I identify with. It's mine. And where did I mine it from? Where did I mine it from? So how did it become mine? Well, I mined it. Okay. So where did I mine it from? I mined it from the underworld. Okay. So mining it from the underworld makes it mine. And now I say it's in my mind because I mined it and it belongs to me. It's my thoughts, not my thoughts. I just mined it. And when I mined it, I called it mine. And now we say that this is my mind. Carrying on what I'm mining. So you see this whole identity process is related to ownership. And the ownership process is relating to what we are getting from the underworld. And the underworld is a reflection of the etheric field, which is a reflection of matter. So this is what Cosmic's saying, basically, in a sense, that.
I feel that.
Yeah, please do.
I feel like the mind is in the brain is not where the memories reside, and that it's not where the consciousness resides. I feel like we know that there's the emotions are stored in the organs, and there's other neurons in the heart and all the organs as well. So the mind is not, or the brain is not solitary in being able to facilitate parts of the nervous system that hold thought. But in addition to that, I feel like the brain is just a place where records are kept. And so even though the mind is beyond the body in an energetic field that we haven't really been able to map yet, we don't have the instrumentation to map out the energetic aspects of our body, of the cell, of the atom. So that's something that quantum physics is working on, trying to be able to recognize these energetic components that we don't see with the physical eye. But I feel like the mind is likely beyond the body and probably connected through morphic fields to other minds. I feel like the mind is not an island. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like the mind maybe does use the brain to store records there. That, and the sense organs themselves are probably what have the memories, I feel like, because without those sense organs, the brain can't just conjure up a feeling based on an image from the eyes or something else that's not that actual sense organ that's familiar with the thing that you have an affinity to. So I feel like the organs recognize the familiarity. The mind pulls up the record that familiarity comes with something that's an affinity, or it could be the opposite. And so through the checks and balances of the records in the mind, the mind is able to operate through those memories that are held down as an anchor in the physical realm. But the mind is more freer than that and can create new interpretations and new memories. And sometimes I feel like when there's damage in the brain, we can lose the connection of the old records, but we can always create new understandings.
I like to use the metaphor of the mind in relation to the universal mind as kind of like a backyard without a fence. Like, because you have a clearly defined boundary as to what your mind is, but obviously, little squirrels and weeds can kind of creep into your yard, and your neighbor's dog can come into your yard too. It's not really a closed off system, but there clearly is like a kind of like, I guess there's a space that represents you within that sort of larger space. I also like to think of it as sort of like an open bottle at the bottom of the ocean. It's like you have the inside of your bottle, which is like your kind of like your own headspace, but then the mind is the water that's within the bottle and the ocean. So there is that sort of like that sort of distinction. I guess I'm also thinking like in terms of like, when we think of like ownership, maybe it's not so much like when we're thinking about like how do we determine like what's our thoughts and what's not our thoughts, what's our mind, what's universal mind. Maybe it's more like a kind of a gravity kind of thing, like an orientation. Like I think about like music I like versus music I don't like. When I think about the music I like, it's almost like that music, it resonates with me. And I think the reason we like the music that we like is it makes us feel more like ourselves. It's like it taps us into our own kind of source energy. And I think that's kind of like what's interesting about music is everybody has like totally different tastes in terms of like what they like and what they don't like. And we all kind of like resonate with different energies, different frequencies. So like, and I guess I think of it in kind of a synesthetic sense, but I think this kind of helps you kind of like, figure it out. Like if you're somebody who really likes orange sounding music or music and like that just invokes the color orange, or you like orange things, your inner space is most likely going to be orange because that's kind of a reflection of your soul. So maybe you have like a certain frequency. No, actually, I think a magnet is a better metaphor. Like you have a certain frequency and things that have a similar kind of correspondence to you sort of are magnetically attracted to you, and that kind of creates like you're like your own sort of inner solar system. Like you're the sun, and all the ideas that you kind of have are like the planets that sort of orbit around said sun. So yeah, I think that when it comes to like understanding how the mind is sort of connected to outer spaces, it's really interesting. But what I do in my Zarfexology practice, so it's like you have the human mind, and then you kind of have the sort of the earth human collective, consciousness. This is taking it a step further. It's like what lies beyond the human collective consciousness. And, you kind of realize that with my practice, it's kind of like the Fae that I work with, they have their own consciousness collective outside of ours, but then both of our collectives are part of an even larger collective that's so beyond mental comprehension. And this is kind of like in essence the sort of how you study mind space and its different kind of emanations and dimensional sort of variations by kind of looking at things as sort of these like these collective spheres of consciousness. That's essentially what a Zarfex is. It's a collective sort of hyperdimensional sphere of consciousness, and there's like multiple of them out there. So I think I kind of forgot what the initial question was, or the train of thought I was starting on. But I think when it comes to I think, yeah, it's a good point to consider that the mind is not confined to your head, and that's kind of the thing with channeling too, is that you start to realize, like, one of the things that happens with me in channeling the Fae is that for some reason, there's a kind of association with the number 23. And one thing I noticed that the Fae are really like talking to me is I'll look at the clock and it says 23. And this almost always happens when the connection is strong. When the connection, the channeling session is very strong and I really feel the presence, it's like the more synchronicities that happen depending upon how strong the connection is. So if like the connection's kind of weak, I'm not really feeling it that day, I don't really get a lot of synchronicities. But if they're really vivid, it's like, oh my God, they're actually here. I start seeing tons of synchronicities, tons of weird numbers, stuff happening. So, and that to me has kind of opened my mind up to the sort of the larger outer mind that exists beyond our body and our skull.
Mic drop.
Well, that
Good.
Please do, brother.
Yeah, I've had kind of a channeling breakthrough here. It's just come to me that maybe the brain is the place where the programming resides, whereas the mind is the agent, able to explore. And so when somebody has a stroke and they cannot speak or walk anymore, they are able to learn how to speak and walk again. They have to do it like they're learning it all over again. The mind is still there and active, but the brain has been damaged. And so the programming has been damaged. And so in a lot of ways, the damage of our programming can really allow us to reprogram ourselves. And so when I had brain surgery in 2007 as a result of a head trauma, I was able to reprogram my life and became a different person. I was a person that was in deep inner turmoil, and it was self-wrought, and I was pushing it on others as well. And then when I had the chance to reprogram myself, I was able to unlearn everything that I had known and learn all these new things. And so it doesn't have to be a point where you have to learn to walk and speak again to be able to reprogram. When I came out of brain surgery, I was able to think and walk and speak fine, but I was then able to reprogram my brain with my mind. So I feel like there could be that understanding of the relationship between the two. The mind can operate without the brain, but the brain can help the mind refer to habits that will allow us to not have to use the mind as much. They say that when we use true consciousness, you're no longer using habits. You're no longer referring to familiar things that you usually do. When you're using true consciousness, you're reprogramming. They say we don't do that much, only 5% of the time at most.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, much of reality is really this, what we're talking about. We're not really looking. Our memory is filling in the gaps. Our imagination is filling in the gaps. And when you stop and look, it's like you have an out-of-the-body experience.
Yeah.
So now that's interesting. The moment you stop and look, you have an out-of-the-body experience. Well, what does that tell you? Just consider it. Like you meet a friend and they say, hey, there's a mushroom brew. Have some of this. You have some of that and you're out of the body. Why? Because you started looking. Like the walls are breathing. The trees are spouting light. There's little patterns of energy around everything. Like, I'm not alone. who are these little guys? Like, who are these little guys? And what are they doing here? What's that village doing? Why didn't I see that village there before? Like what is going on? Like, am I in Smurfville or what happened? And it's got to be careful not to go too high because Bush Whisperer is rocking his favorite suit today, and not as elegantly dressed as our dear brother Indy there. So I got to be careful. Like I'll be arrested if I stand up. But there's definitely this notion, and what else was it that you said that was so poignant that really hit the bell? Oh yes, program. Okay, program. So we know what a gram is, right? Is it a telegram? No. A gram. I'm going to send a telegram. Yeah, a telegram. I'm going to send you a message. Communication. Telegram. But it's also mass, grams. Yeah, gram. Like pro-mass. Okay, program is to be pro-mass, is to be oriented. So we need to be programmed to experience mass. What a concept. And the moment we stop programming ourselves to experience mass, what happens? All right. It's when you look. It's when you open your eyes and start paying attention. It's like out of the body. So what is this body? And it brings us back to what Cosmic was saying earlier about, consciousness and the body. And what is consciousness? People always want to intellectualize consciousness, and they want to say that consciousness is this thing of this etheric thing. And it's like, yes, but what is the body? The body is programs of consciousness that we are experiencing. And we've become so reliant upon these particular programs of consciousness that we now feel ourselves embedded within the program, the matrix. So this matrix that we're experiencing, which seems to be such a limiting reality, is in like all those distinctions that Cosmic was also talking about, the separations, the boundaries, this garden without a fence, right? Those fences, that is all part of the program. And the moment we start actually looking at the garden, we notice that there isn't really a fence. It seemed like there was a fence because there's some bushes around the garden. But if you actually look at the bushes, like you can actually just walk right through the bushes. You go, oh, wow. There's a relative privacy that we take for granted. We say, look, this is my private space. But only just because you're not looking through the bushes. Part the bushes and you see, whoa, there's a whole world out here. And it's like you can literally walk in and out of the property. You don't need a key. And so that's like quite an interesting perspective to look at consciousness as being, when I think of consciousness, this is what I think of. I think of conch representing the primal sound of vibration. And the conch is carrying Zeus, which is that thought. So the Zeus is being moved by the conch. So conch, Zeus, and then Ness. Now, when I think of Ness, I think of that transformative potential of Scorpio in the form of a fish that is swimming through a energetic field of life force, and it is being carried by the patterns of the serpent, Ness, consciousness. So it's got the hiss of the serpent, which is the card that relates to strength, which is actually a reflection of Jupiter, because we're thinking about Samek. But Samek has got this reflective connection with Tet, with strength. And Samek represents something that props something up. So it's that which props up the universe, gives it like structure, which obviously relates to Jupiter's house, right? In terms of Sagittarius. And we've got this consciousness. And yes.
Sorry, I might have to bow out for a little bit, but we'll be back in about an hour.
God bless you. God bless your partner. Much love to her. I hope you guys have a peaceful ceremony. I hope she finds joy in this challenging time.
Thank you so much. Means a lot.
Much
I'll be
love, man.
spirit, and I shall see you soon.
Om Shanti.
Take it easy,
Bless
man.
you.
This
Bye,
was-
brother. So yeah, this consciousness. I think of this ness, and it makes me think of the nose, the nose, and the nose then represents like our sense of smell, right? Represents like that most physical aspect. So the smell then represents like the experience of things, sensation. I think when I think of Ness, this Nun, Aleph, and Samek, they seem to bring us back to that structuring thing, and that structuring final bottom line is smell, which is why animals are so governed by their sense of smell. So if you see consciousness, it's how the vibrational field of the universe brings the principle of thought into tangible experience, which is propped up on a solid thing and can be smelt, consciousness. And so that's what consciousness represents to me. It's an entire broad spectrum. And I think that when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about Mercury, fundamentally. And so it sort of brings me back to what you were saying, Cosmic, about the way in which, we think of consciousness as being in our head. But what is the head? I think Indy really nailed it down when he said head and, the programming. And so then what does that mean about mind if we really look into it? If we're pretty much on the same page then, right? Would you say, Cosmic? When it comes to thinking about what mind means.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I've also kind of been thinking lately too. I think that, I think physical sort of sensations, whether it be pleasures or pains, can kind of locate our consciousness at a certain level. Because I noticed that I'm more in my head when I have headaches. Maybe I'm in my head because I have headaches because I'm in my head. But you feel that when you have like a certain physical pain, it locks your consciousness in that particular spot. That's why I think I remember you were talking last time that if you want to relieve a headache, think about like some completely different body part. And I think there's definitely some wisdom there when it comes to that sort of idea. As regards to consciousness, I always think of it, the Fae kind of taught me to understand it as awareness plus being equals consciousness. A plus B equals C. I think of it like that. So by awareness, there's that projecting kind of like outward, looking out into the world, and then being more represents that internal sort of sense. It's sort of everything kind of like comes sort of inward, sort of that inward feeling, your body, your sense of tired or relaxed or whatever. And it's these two aspects of consciousness that make consciousness experience as it is. Because I was thinking like there's two actually different kinds of sort of like unconscious states. There's the state of mind when you're in dreamless sleep, and there's the state of mind when you're pretty much like you're so deep into a psychedelic trip you basically kind of lose your ego. So the way I kind of framed that is that when you're asleep, your consciousness, and you're in dreamless sleep, your consciousness is in pure being and lacks awareness. Whereas when you're in a psychedelic trip and you forget your body, you forget who you are, you forget your identity, you feel like you're one with the universe. In that state of mind, it's more like you are pure awareness devoid of being. So these are like two different polarities of the conscious soul. And that when both of these elements are put together, that's when we have the kind of the known conscious experience that we have. And so the way and then this is kind of explains how consciousness sort of evolves. It starts from these two poles that sort of come together. So you start with sort of like the universal kind of like mind, that's just like pure mind, and you have like the kind of the universal body, and you see, and then the two sort of interact with each other, and the interactions that happen in between is where life forms, worlds, and conscious beings emerge from. So I think of it, when I think of consciousness, my understanding is it's awareness plus being. Because it seems like with a lot of, I think another reason why we have such a difficult time with consciousness and understanding is that people want to say consciousness is either just awareness or just being. Like maybe, some of the Buddhist types might want to say consciousness is just pure awareness and being is an illusion. That's why there's all the kind of this emphasis on like, giving up material possessions and worldly things. Likewise, a materialist who says everything is made of matter might say everything is pure being, and that awareness, as I defined it, is essentially a kind of an illusion, and that we're just sort of the mechanical awareness of atoms. But I think it's actually, these are two aspects that need to be kind of like put together to sort of solve a larger equation. I think when you have that kind of two-pronged approach to understanding consciousness, instead of this idea that it has to come from one specific source, I think then you can kind of get, this model seems a lot more intuitive for understanding this.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You bring up some really interesting points there. And I agree with you that these two aspects are what we're really talking about. And that's how Mercury finds its way on this table. Because Mercury represents the reconciliation between these two different aspects, right? That's fundamentally what Mercury is. That's what the Caduceus symbolizes. That's what the Tao, the Yang Yin symbolizes. Two things that are becoming one, or one thing that is becoming two. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. So when we look at the Caduceus, the one aspect of the Caduceus, like you say, represents two aspects that create one aspect. We could think of this as the rising force. Yeah? But then when we look at it from the other perspective, the falling force, we could think of it as one aspect that becomes two aspects. What came first, the chicken or the egg? In as much as that is being and awareness an extraction of consciousness. So you've got consciousness that exists. And then consciousness divides itself into two things. One thing is being, and one thing is awareness. And then consciousness works through both being and awareness, but in two opposite ways, on the one hand. On the other hand, we are then here in this dilemma of this dichotomy of duality, which is reflecting polarity, which we are now in this state of having separated being from awareness, where we now wish to reunify awareness and being to become one, so that we can experience full consciousness. And so I think you see where I'm coming from here.
Yeah.
The chicken and the egg, it's like that figure of eight. They work from two different directions, telling the same story back to front. And somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the middle of all of this, there's just pure consciousness, which is that completes. And so this idea of the head, I think it's a dangerous idea.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's dangerous because it means that we feel the need to draw this distinction between consciousness and awareness, and between awareness and being, when being is a natural expression of awareness, which is a natural expression of consciousness. So there is actually no difference between consciousness or awareness or being. Matter is actually thought, which is actually an expression of energy, right? So now we can use like physics terms, right? So the principles are not separate to the energy that produces the object. But the object is essentially just energy. And the energy is essentially just principles. So these fundamental principles are really the substance of matter. And matter is really the structure of the fundamental principles. And energy is really a reflection of these principles in motion to produce matter. And so when we start to like put these three together, these are like three different, and when I'm saying matter, I'm not talking about what we consider matter. I'm talking about the etheric, the beginning and the ending. So like the word etheric is alef-tet, which relates to, that tet relates to the endings of things, the Saturn's cross, the last letter of the 22. And the aleph is the first, which represents the fool. So the union between the fool and the world. Her dancing naked with the spiral sash of the moon around her, keeping all that structure in place, with the fool just stepping off into the infinite, represents this beginning and ending, the alpha and the omega. And so this alpha and the omega and the beginning and the ending is what we could call et, which is the basis of Aetheric, right? So this has got to do with structure and form. And then, of course, when we look at the other one, the astral, and I've mentioned this before, Esh is fire and Stral is beam. So we're talking about that beam of light that comes from that fire principle, which is essentially what we're looking at when we look at the astral. It's not formed. It's a ray of light. It's so abstract. And so we are somehow in our minds trying to give an idea a place to exist conceptually when the idea really exists here as an object. Hope that makes sense. You following me, right, Cosmic?
For the most part, yeah.
So this concept of separating object from idea, and Buddhism does actually do quite well in reminding us that thoughts are objects. And so we like to draw distinctions between thoughts and objects. And people say, oh, well, my little boy was saying this to me earlier today. Hey, brother, welcome back. My little boy was saying this to me today about, oh, but that's just in the imagination. What was that yesterday? He was saying it to me yesterday. I was like, what do you mean, just in the imagination? No, well, that stuff only exists in the imagination. I said, well, what doesn't exist in the imagination, my son? And he looked at me. I said to him, are you not imagining all this around you in your mind? His little eyes went big, like grasping the idea that this is all, we're just imagining reality. And so this is like shamanic dream time. So the shamanic dream time speaks of the three different aspects of dream time. And this brings us back to your four worlds, because these three aspects of dream time coalesce, right? And the coalescing of these three aspects of dream time is essentially what we're experiencing here as the physical realm. Welcome back, dear brother Indy. I take it you're on the phone, yeah?
Yes, I'm on the phone now. I'm just probably going to be listening in mostly.
Much love, man. Sounds beautiful. The birds there.
Yeah.
So this coalescing of these three elements is what gives rise to the seven principles of Hermes. So when we're talking about the Caduceus and we're talking about Mercury, we're talking about Hermes. We're talking about magic. We're talking about those seven divine principles that are actually the way in which we realize the three fundamental principles. There are only really three. And those three fundamental principles are really that there's a staff and there are two serpents. That's all there is. And you notice how when that staff and those two serpents come together and they wind up, what do we get on the top of the staff? We get a sphere forming, right? So Hermes is explaining to us in the Caduceus that you have 3 states of being, 3 worlds. And when those 3 worlds come together, they form a 4th world. Isn't that what the Zarfexology is expressing? Is not one of those 4 worlds really all 3 of the worlds working together?
It's it's kind of hard to say because I'm not really sure exactly, like temporally speaking, how Zarfexes are formed in terms of like, it's not, there's a sense of like, because we're talking about non-linear time, right? And there's all these different like dimensions of like time goes into like all these weird dimensions. So it's like you got like the straight line sort of linear time, then that expands into a ripple, and then that time expands into a sphere, and that sphere is within a larger sphere of time. So I think that it's kind of like I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but the Zarfex thing, sort of like, I don't know. I lost my train of thought. But
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is the first 3 aspects going to be like the Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna, and then the 4th is the sphere?
Well, the thing about the in Zarfexology is that every kind of everything is sort of divided into Zerfaxes. Now, what a Zerfax is, it's essentially kind of, think of like whatever room you're existing in as its own kind of universe, and that's sort of like a sphere. But each one of these spheres has 4 membranes that surround it, sort of like 4 cell layers. And so like your first layer would basically be kind of like all of the alternative possibilities that can exist within that realm. So let's say like right now, I have a can of ginger ale on my desk. And that implies that there's a universe where there's not a can of ginger ale on my desk. So that is kind of like where the first membrane is all about. The second membrane has to deal with all the adjacent Zerfaxes. So I'm in my bedroom right now, and I can see there's a closed door right in front of me, and I know there's a world outside of that door. This is where the second membrane is talking about. Or if you're out in a field and you see a forest, like whatever is outside of your peripheral vision. Then the third membrane has to deal more with the universe itself. It's sort of like the sky or the ambient color. So let's say you got a clear blue sky for a particular day. Then you have kind of like a blue third membrane. Or if it's nighttime, that membrane might be black. If it's a cloudy, overcast day, the membrane is gray. And I think one of the things they talk about, like, in terms of dimensional travel, is all about learning to manipulate the color of that third membrane to align with the desired dimension that you want to travel to. And then the fourth membrane is how the Zerfax is connected to the rest of the Zarfex. And it's kind of like the same. It's like it's the whole larger Zarfex mind is connected to that. And that's where a lot of people put their belief systems into, which is what kind of blocks access to the understanding of the outer Zarfex, and where there's, instead of this one membrane which is open to these other universes that exist outside of it, it then gets closed off by whatever you perceive to be ultimate reality. And so the 4 bodies that I'm talking about, so the way they do it is settings. Wait, what was I going to do? Share screen. Window. I'm going to get something out real quick right here. This is. So,
yeah, this getting
so
also back
here, this is
okay.
how they kind of represent the 4 bodies, right? So you have, this is what's known as the Vidzervax. Each one of these triangles, it's kind of like a flower, and each one of these triangles represents a different body, which is Yeah, it's represented by that. And then the circle in the center is kind of like the center of your being. So each one of these triangles represents a different body of the self. And this whole thing altogether kind of is what makes up the soul. I think that's kind of an important source. And that symbol, it's interesting. It's actually like another symbol called, like, it's like basically just a triangle, and they just kind of like form a circle. I didn't even, when I made that symbol on my channel, I didn't realize like that's what it was. That just sort of manifested itself accidentally. It wasn't even intentional, but it's like, so when it comes to understanding the four bodies, like that's the thing with the Fae, is that they can exist in four places at once or more, depending upon how developed they are. So there's like cycles of development. Like it's weird because it's like they're not physical beings, but they're organisms. They're these living things. It's like they're beings of like pure organic energy, if you will. And I'm trying to figure out where I was going this. And then sort of the Zarfex is sort of your relationship to that.
Barbara Marciniak wrote some books about the Palladians. I believe it was in the 70s and 80s, and they referred to the Palladians back then as energetic beings. They're definitely life forms, but they don't have a physical component to their body besides their energetic aspects. Now, I think other people have come up with different ways to interpret the Palladians since Barbara Marciniak, but I just wanted to point that out. It's a very interesting kind of conundrum that's got a parallel in the starseeds.
Yeah, so basically the way matter is understood in Zarfexology is that we live in what's known as a Zorfex. This is sort of the cluster of Zarfexes that we all live in. And I'm going to do another diagram here real quick.
Oh, yeah. And interestingly, these energetic beings, when I tried to talk to one of the channeling starseeds that was speaking to me from their starseed mind, they told me that the DNA enhancement that they do, that you pay $999 to get your DNA activation, it can activate up to 12 strands of DNA. They claim that those 12 strands, or the 10 beyond the 2, are an energetic component of the DNA. It's not actually seen in the molecular structure of the deoxyribonucleic acid. This is kind of a side tangent, but they talk about how there's components of us that's not seen, that's only energetic too.
I mean, that definitely checks out, that there's sort of a physical component to being, but I think that there also would be a necessary energetic component of the being as well, which would be translated to soul. So the way matter is understood in the Zarfexology. So here you have 4 different basic types of Zarfexes, right? So at the top, we have what's known as the isotholidocratha, or this is sort of the plasma Zarfex plane. This is almost like all the Zarfexes below interconnected into one. And so it's kind of like a meta Zarfex that kind of like oversees all this stuff. And I notice I have them noted as plasma, gaseous, fluid, and solid. So I like to think of each one of these planes as being a different temperature. At the top, it's very hot, and at the bottom, it's very cold. And so once you get to plasma, then you get down to gas with gaseous Zarfexes. These are more kind of like purely like mental, sort of like it's a white void Zarfex. And so it's a lot of kind of like just sort of like pure information. There's not a lot of form that takes place in this realm. It's just sort of like pure light and information and insight. Then you go down to the fluid Zarfexes. These are more like Zarfexes that are like, if you took a universe and it's nothing but, it's like a self-contained astral plane. There's no physical universe. There's just a slightly more dense astral plane that exists in the center. And this is sort of like fluid. And notice as we go down the planes, it's sort of consciousness is getting sort of colder and colder. But then once we go down to the solid Zarfexes where we are, that energy literally freezes and crystallizes in the same way if you take water and you put it in a cold place, it turns into a sheet of ice that can't really be moved unless you sort of hit it with a hammer. And the black void plane, which is what our Zarfex exists on. That plane, it takes that consciousness and it freezes it into physical matter, so that there's this kind of this thing. But what that does, and the reason why it exists, is it provides a sort of foundation for all these upper Zarfexes to exist. Because if this bottom row doesn't exist, all these Zarfexes just sort of collapse and fall down. Like imagine like you have a like a bottle filled with sand, right? The bottle gives that sand a sense of shape and it gives it a sense of form, but without the bottle, the sand just kind of collapses and falls over the place. So basically, without these solid Zarfexes of matter, all the other Zarfexes around would essentially sort of disintegrate into pure chaos. So it's kind of like there's a reason like why it exists, and so you have to understand like matter as essentially consciousness being crystallized. I think that's the best way. It's crystallized consciousness that's crystallized, so it's so cold and so rock solid that it's difficult for the mind to penetrate and control it. It can be done with conceded efforts, but there's a lot more inertia. Whereas if I took something from a fluid Zarfex, in a fluid Zarfex realm, the objects and things around me are more malleable to matter. They're more easily influenced by thoughts. But the more dense these Zarfexes become, the harder it is, the more effort, the more inertia one has to overcome for the mind to sort of magically affect matter. And that's kind of how I basically analyze this with this Zarfexology stuff.
That's totally interesting, and I think there's a lot here to unpack. What you were saying, Cosmic, about the way in which the nature of this existence of physical matter is almost a confluence between the other points of existence, that it binds them, holds them, keeps them in place. From a Kabbalistic perspective, one considers that Atzilut is the fundamental archetypal state, the fundamental state of being. Maybe not even archetypal. Archetypal would be considered the Bria. This is the emotional thing, aspect of the universe. And so Bria then becomes how these archetypal structures emerge from that absolute unity of Atzilut. And then how from this Bria comes Yetzirah. And Yetzirah then represents this differentiated state with all these different aspects of reality, all bound in a pattern, dancing their own particular dance of unity in the sphere of differentiation. And then we have what we call this Asaya, which is really that dark physical matter that you're talking about, of pressure and compression, that sort of is a reflection of all of these above, but in terms of like a crystallized aspect of consciousness. And so then we could say that consciousness has three aspects, that there are three reflections of consciousness, three ways in which consciousness exists fundamentally in its most fundamental state, which is, we're looking at the doctrine of the four worlds, for example. And you were saying that, like, even with your model, it seems to add up to the same numbers to what I'm seeing in all the other mystical traditions, in as much as that matter is that binding principle that keeps all the others in check, though is a reflection of all of the others, in as much as that you've got the Caduceus, you've got the one serpent, you've got the other serpent, you've got that fundamental staff, you've got these three principles, and these three principles are being intertwined and bound, and we have a sphere, and that sphere is what keeps the axis mundi balancing the other two principles. And so the axis mundi then becomes that concept that has been crystallized in our consciousness as the tree of life, which represents the roots digging into the underworld, and the branch and the leaves moving towards the divine planes of consciousness, representing the three aspects of creation as in the most simplest and basic core ways of understanding it through the shamanic principles as the three aspects of dream time: the divine dream time and the energetic shift of dream time, and then the underworld aspect of dream time, where the roots and the trunk and the branches and the leaves all come together to produce this dream time that we're living in, which holds and binds all three dream times together, much the way that you were saying, Cosmic, that fourth. And here's an interesting thing is, even when we look at these four worlds, there are essentially three membranes separating all four of the worlds, because that's how four worlds work, right? You got four things, but when you look at those four things, you got three fundamental membranes. And so in yoga, we got the muladhara band, which is that root chakra band. It's a band in the body that you can close, and it's got to do with bringing the energy into the physical manifestational gram mass body. And then we've got this band which is close to the Hrit Padma, between the Manipura chakra, the solar fire, and the Anahata chakra, which is what, if you've ever had a knot in your stomach, that's that band activating. It can be, so fear and extreme shock can activate your muladhara band. That's when your anus is clamping, when you're so afraid, right? Like, let's say you wake up one morning and the whole world is like turning into a volcano around your house. That anus is going to be clamping like this, tell you. There's nowhere to go, but it's just hot rock everywhere. Anus is going to be working hard. But if you're like really frustrated and irritable because someone's getting on your nerves, if you work in an office and someone's just ticking you off, the boss is just on your case with little details, and they're not really understanding what's going on the floor because they're sitting in their office detached. But now it's your problem to try and make the impossible possible, so that someone who doesn't appreciate what is possible can tick it on their little box of lists. That frustration, anger, and irritability can cause a lump in the stomach, which can cause your stomach to clamp up. You can't eat. You become so neurotic. And then, of course, there's the lump you get in your throat. That's the third band, the vishuddha chakra band, which is when you get so overwhelmed by nostalgia, feelings, and emotions that you can't even talk because it feels like you got a lump in your throat. So we literally say you got a lump in your throat, you got a knot in your stomach, or your anus is clamping and opening and clamping. So these are the three bands that separate these four divisions within the physical body, reflecting the divine. And so these three bands also represent three aspects. So this is like the three aspects of the Caduceus or Caduceus, bound in the physical flesh of the body. And it's reflecting these fundamental divine principles and processes behind the structuring of the divine architecture of space and time. And so this fourth aspect is literally the matrix that keeps everything together. And look at the word matrix, right? If you're making something, the matrix is the base substance that you put the other things into, right? Like, let's say an artist wants to manufacture some piece of three-dimensional art. They'll need a matrix to work in. And then they'll use other mediums to add the different mediums to the matrix to give you a full product reflecting the ideas, the feelings, and the concepts that they are loading into the matrix. And so there we've got an interesting choice of words: ideas, feelings, and concepts, right? So a feeling, we know what a feeling is. It's a refined emotion that has become refined. A concept is a broad sphere of idea which is relating to emotion, but not emotion, relating to the sphere of emotion. In other words, it's that aspect of the intelligence which isn't rational intelligence, because to conceive and to have a concept involves creativity, and that creative impression means that it's coming out of a proverbial womb of thought, where an idea is like it's a constructed thing. It's something that, like a ball that I can hit. It's an idea, and that idea can lead to another idea and can lead to, but it takes a whole lot of ideas to be in sync to reflect a concept, because a concept is so much more profound than an idea. And so we've got the concept, we've got the idea, and these two then represent, the serpents, the concept and the idea. And yeah, we're seeing the Caduceus once again. So Mercury represents that aspect of the human psyche, to be able to touch into the deep conceptual structures of the consciousness field, extract ideas from the deep conceptual substance, and reflect those ideas into the plasma, the energy, the feelings, so that this becomes a reflective experience that we can harness and hold and touch and measure and smell and weigh. And it's interesting, when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about weighing matter, right? Which matter are we talking about? This matter or that matter? So a matter that is being discussed is a series of ideas that are relating to a concept which is more abstract. So we can't really talk about concepts. We can discuss the ideas that we have of concepts. And then these ideas of these concepts, we can then weigh our thoughts up. And this becomes a way of perceiving reality. And so we see the perception is a way of perceiving through awareness, because we have to be aware in order to focus the beam of perception. And once we focus that beam of perception, we are then able to get an idea of the concept reflected by the awareness of the situation of consciousness. So it's a very interesting way of understanding and conceiving of the Caduceus, which represents these three principles, the three worlds of the shaman, or the Atzilut, the Bria, the Yetzirah of the tree of life of the Kabbalistic, or the Idda, the Pingala, or the Sashumna of the Vedic schools,